On today's episode of the Soundiron Podcast, Mike Peasley and I sit down with former Cinesamples and Musio CEO Chris Hayzel. During our conversation with Chris, we explore the evolution of music creation, distribution, and the modern realities of being a working musician. We also explore how streaming and digital platforms have changed the economic landscape for musicians, the rise of content-driven careers, and the necessity for diversification in today's creative economy. So without further ado, enjoy today's podcast.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Yeah, it's good to talk to you. We first started talking to you back at Musio. You kind of were the engine that sort of, I think, drove third-party outreach and a lot of the marketing and strategy for that. And you've since kind of leaped out to do a lot more business to business and well, I mean, you're doing a lot of different stuff, so I don't want to put words in your mouth. Can you tell us what you've been up to?
Yeah, sure. We met doing the third-party outreach stuff for Cinesamples. In 2024, I was the CEO of Cinesamples, and our big project that year was the Musio Marketplace. And you guys were one of the first companies that we actually reached out to be included in the Musio Marketplace. And we met at NAMM last year, which is cool because we're coming up on NAMM this year soon. But since then, I've actually left Cinesamples and I kind of started my own consulting business doing branding and marketing for music tech companies, but a whole bunch of different projects and companies. So music tech is my background, but I like to kind of branch out and just help cool people do cool things. So I'm just looking for cool people doing cool things and trying to help them do that. You know what I mean?
What was your background in music? I mean, as a musician and sort of that side of it, because that's something that you kind of were steeped in, that you kind of came up through, right?
Yeah. So this whole branding and marketing thing was kind of an accident. It was born out of turning 30, I need a real job kind of moment at 4 a.m. I started as a touring musician. Well, it started playing in bands from the time that I was 13 on. Growing up playing metal, and then as I got older, playing less metal, more rock, that sort of transition where you're like, oh, maybe we need more singing and a little less screaming in this music. Let's try and do something a little more palatable for other people. But as you do, or as it does, the taste in music kind of changes as you grow as a person. And just playing in bands, recording records, writing records, producing records, touring, and doing all of that, living in a van, eating dry ramen.
What was your instrument?
Mainly in the bands, I would play guitar and sing, but my favorite instrument to play is drums, and I play a bunch of other instruments too.
Are you still making music, just kind of in your own way, or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course. Actually, I started writing and recording a new record for the first time since 2020, last year, and it's been slow going. I mean, I'm a dad now, so I've got a little 4-year-old. So I'm sure you guys know. Mike, I know you've got kids. Craig, do you have kids too? No.
A couple dogs.
Okay. Dogs are kids, right?
I'm a dog dad.
Never grow up.
Yeah. But you know how that goes. It's first and foremost comes time with the family, and then there's work, and then there's time to make music. So just finding the spaces in between to still engage with that creative part of myself. But it's been really cool. I had a weird midlife crisis purchase moment last year where I realized that I've been touring and playing in bands and recording records since 13. I'm 36, and I was in that entire time, I've never bought myself a nice piece of musical gear. I've never bought a nice guitar or anything like that. And I was like, that's weird. All my guitars are, guitars that I got that were half broken for $100 on Craigslist, and I fixed them or something like that. And so I was like, well, I have a job now and I'm a dad now, and I can do what the dentists do and actually buy myself like, a Telecaster or something like that. And so I went on this purchasing spree and I spent like $7,000 on music equipment just out of nowhere. I was like, oh, I'll finance it all. And then I got it all, and I was like, well, I better do something with this. So I started recording, and that's been a really fun process, actually. And I plugged it in. I plugged in the telly when I got it, and I was like, I started recording on it, and I was like, the tone that I had struggled with all of these other guitars to get over the years, and I was just like trying to tweak it and, tweak the amp and then tweak it in post and blah, blah, blah. And then I just plugged the telly in and I started playing it, and I was like, oh, that's why people spend money on instruments.
Mm-hmm. It's funny how, especially in the early days, like, because I could totally relate to you, because most of my guitars that I got growing up were like maybe $250, $300 the most or something. I got them, like with a discount at some guitar shop near where I lived. And it's funny how you use those the most, and then as you get older, and you're like, you know what, I'm gonna spoil myself a little bit.
Yeah, I'm gonna splurge on something.
Yeah, and it's like you take all those years that you didn't spend anything on nice music gear, and it just all happens at one time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's funny how that happens.
Yeah,
because I didn't have a nice guitar or like anything that was like a boutique or something until probably over 20 years of playing.
Yeah,
it's crazy how that works.
Yeah, it's wild. But then you get it and you plug it in, you're like, wow, that sounds like a telly.
My journey with that was with microphones. That's kind of actually how Soundiron was able to kind of get started. I had been doing field recording, and I was a singer in bands and making music. But I had always, used like these much smaller microphones and, with what I could afford, but decided, we just finished a couple of video games I was the sound designer on, and we did really well. And I felt it was time to splurge on some really good Neumann mics. And that is really what it made a lot of what we do possible, because the noise on them was low enough to really sample the hell out of a lot of instruments without hiss.
Yeah.
And then it just became so much easier to do so much more. And since then, I've kind of gotten insane with geeking out on different kinds of microphones.
Oh, yeah. And there's so much character difference between them, too. My go-to is a Telefunken, was a CU29. I don't think they even make them anymore. They have like a new version of it or whatever. But I remember when I bought that, it was like in 2012 or something like that. And I bought it and I was like, holy shit, this thing is beautiful.
Yeah.
Just the warmth and the crispiness in the high end, but it wasn't too harsh. And it was like, wow, because before that, just like you had been recording on, budget mics. And when you get something nice, it really makes a difference. Had you already been sampling instruments on the other mics before you got the Neumanns?
I had been doing a lot of Foley and a lot of field recording and sound effects on one hand, but starting to do musical instruments. And the best mic I had at the time for that was an NT4, a Rode.
Yeah.
It's like the stereo mic. It's huge and heavy, but it sounds really good. But, especially on things that are close up. So I did the old busted granny piano with that, and a few other smaller instruments. And from time to time, I'll still use it, especially for Foley. But it was like, a lot of different things, but I never really got deep until I had these big honkin' TLM 103s. I mean, big for relative to what I had been working with. I had before that, like, I think it was like a 40. No, you know what? I'm just gonna forget it. It was like a 4022 or something. It was an Audio Technica, but it was a large diaphragm mic, but it was like the best I knew of at the time. I never imagined I could afford something like a Neumann, but the 103s were, actually kind of attainable price wise.
Sure.
And they were, but once I got those, I really, then you could really get an amazing stereo image and really clear sound. And it just changed something mentally for me. Like, I can record drums, I can record all this different stuff. And I just started putting them in front of everything. Building like like little blimps for them so we could record outside, just all kinds of weird stuff. And from there, then I started exploring, like, using a soldering iron and playing with like vintage mics, and just, I don't know, something about it went from being a fascination to an obsession.
That's like, amazing.
Those mics
just opened up a whole new world, huh?
Yeah. I've always been really interested in Telefunken mics. They have the same pedigree as Neumann's.
Mm-hmm.
And they have these super low noise Omni mics that I've really been interested in, but they're hard to find. And I've never, like, I'm back in that phase now where I've got a lot of different really nice mics. And so I can't really justify it to myself. Like, oh, it'll be that, this thing is amazing, but it's hard, it's hard to make it make sense.
Sure.
Okay, I'll get this, I'll get that.
Yeah. That's how I am. That's how I'm with the guitars. I'm just like, man, like, especially looking in the background, it's like, do I need another one? It's like, part of you is like, well, this one's different. It's got this little specific thing, and maybe it'd be cool, kind of get you inspired to maybe like do something new with it. But then just like, I don't know.
Yeah. Do you guys ever have that thing where you get so much gear to where it starts to hamper the creativity? Like, I know that I went through a period of time where this was actually during the time that I had this sort of bass-ackwards career scoring films. I had accumulated all of this studio gear, and then I realized at a certain point I was sitting in my studio and I was like, wow, if I want to make any music, I actually have to turn this on and wait for this to warm up and blah, 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 blah. And so I went through this weird thing where I basically sold most of it, and I just pared it all down to like one preamp, one interface, and I bought like a Rhodes 73. And I was like, I just need to get back to sitting on an instrument and just writing a song rather than trying to piece it all together in the box, like as I go, and using the DAW as a writing tool, which I still like to do. But I need to get back to just like songwriting and picking up like a guitar or sitting down at a keyboard or something like that. Mm-hmm. Do you guys ever find that like the more gear you get, the more sort of like choice paralysis or steps you have to go through to start creating?
Oh yeah. Especially if you're like me and you like, all right, I want to set it up. So, and it's like set and forget. Mm-hmm. But I will forget, and then I'm like, how? And then you come back and you haven't used it in a while, and you're like, wait, how is this thing connected? Like,
oh my
God, I'll go to start working on something. Like I'm currently working on some music just for myself, just because I've been putting it off since it's like almost 10 years since I did first solo record. Mm-hmm. I've been trying to get back into it, just to have sort of a creative outlet for my own. And I'm like, all right, cool. I'm gonna try to set up a template so I could just go in and just start writing. And then I'm like, wait, how come I don't hear any sound? Oh, like I forgot this input's connected to this. So it's it's funny because like when I first started, all I had was an iMac, like a DI box and a Focusrite 2i2.
Right.
I had Logic Pro 9, maybe like one orchestral kind of like sample pack thing that was like super basic, and then maybe one amp sim. I had like the Easy Mix stuff from TuneTrack, which is just super like, oh, cool. You just load it up. It's got presets, and because I didn't know anything about dialing in plugins and stuff like that. I just wanted to be able to work on stuff. And I did a whole record by myself, and it's like, how is it taking me 10 years and I have all the gear I've ever wanted? You know? But also my life has changed significantly in the last 10 years too. So that's another thing. My focus has kind of shifted, especially doing more Soundiron. But yeah, it's very easy that over time you start to get a little thrown off. That's why I've been trying to simplify it, like one amp sim or like recording it with the Kemper or something like that, and just try to not overthink it, because it's so easy to just get into producer mode. It's like whatever. God, like back in like when I listen to old demos, I don't know if you ever, of course, doing
since you do a lot of music production and stuff, you hear old demos that you were like stoked on at the time. And then you hear it now and you're just like, what was I thinking? But then now it's like, I can make everything sound so much better. And then you're just tweaking. And it's like, you need to take off the producer hat for a second and just try to get back into the whole reason why you got into doing it. It's just making music. So it's learning too many things is the problem. Yeah.
I have the opposite problem of I'll listen back to old demos from, like you said, like starting out, I started with Logic when I started to learn production, and I didn't know anything. And so all I was doing really was messing around with some of the built-in like plugins and things like that, and just like setting up a djembe and putting it through a delay, because I didn't even really know what a DAW plugin delay did. I'd only ever used a delay pedal, and so it was like, just boop 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 boop, and just like kind of getting inspired
tweaking
by
knobs,
that.
yeah,
and just exploring, and everything was so simple because I didn't know how to do anything. So it was just sort of like the most rudimentary collection of instruments and making them sound good, as you would if you were a band in a live room playing together. It's like you only have what's at your fingertips, right? And so as I got more into production, you're like, oh, well, I can add this and I can add that, and oh, I can put this on and I can tweak this and I can compress this in such a way and sidechain this and this and all of the stuff. And a lot of times when I get to the end of, a production now, and then I give myself a little bit of space from it, I'll listen to that and go, what was I thinking? Because it's just so full of so many ideas. Whereas when I listen back on stuff from a while ago or a long time ago, it'll be like, wow, that was so simple. So like one of the last EPs that I did, and I say last EPs, I released it in 2017. It was a long time ago. But I remember I set a parameter on myself that I would only basically record the instruments that would be present in a band as if I were mixing a live band. So no, 3 guitars or 4 guitars or, additional guitar parts or crazy, background effects or anything like that. Like this is just, I'm just going to record this EP and produce it as if because I play all the instruments myself. I haven't been in a band since 2013. So it's me just playing all the instruments and recording them and writing all the parts. But I was like, I have one drummer, I have 2 guitar players, I have a bass player, and I have a singer, and maybe a keyboard player, and that's it. That's all I've got. So I have to make it work with that.
Yeah, that's a lot easier than especially as we learn different instruments or how to program stuff. Now when I think of music, I'm thinking of it from that and then an orchestra and then synths and then sound design, and it's like, but it's kind of cool because I feel like sometimes when you're writing, and you're thinking about it in the band context, because because one of the things I always wanted to do was just combine death metal and orchestra. That was like my goal since, I don't know, 2009.
And you do a good job of it, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And it's like now I think about it as like an additional member of the band or members of a band. Because now sometimes you might get to a point where you're like, man, I don't know what to do next. But then you think of what would be going on in the background or some kind of other, sound design or creepy texture. And then that might inspire something. So for me, it kind of helps me break out of, if I'm having a riff rut, I'm just like, oh man, I don't know what to do, or I don't really know where I want the drums to go. That sort of thing kind of helps spark it back up. But then it could also be a little like overwhelming, because then you're like, all right, cool, I got the band stuff done. Now I have to program something for an 80-piece orchestra, and then it's like, oh.
Yeah, even with that, because I had a kind of an awakening when I started getting into scoring films and orchestral music, and that opens up a whole new door and a whole new can of worms, like you're saying. But there's so much beauty to be unlocked in music if you can add those textures without going overboard. You know what I mean? It's like thinking about like to use a super common well-known band, Foo Fighters and Echo Silence, Patience and Grace, and them sort of bringing in more acoustic and orchestral elements into their rock music and adding a cellist live or things like that. It's like that extra texture, if used well and thoughtfully, can really expand things. But then if you get, like in full composer mode, I find that I can absolutely go overboard, and then it's just like cacophony,
Yeah, it's just layers upon layers, and then you eventually go back and just start stripping everything away. And because I do believe the essence of having one or let's say like two, maybe three really good ideas that are sort of similar, like one solid idea, and then just making modification after that. Because you'd be surprised. Like I've done this a few times, or like one time in particular that I remember the most, that I always try to think of, is there's just like 4 chords basically.
Yeah.
And then the whole song was almost based off of that entire thing. Maybe like one other idea or something, but the core of it, you could probably just strum it on an acoustic guitar or something. Because you always hear people saying that if you could play it on a piano or an acoustic guitar and it's still good, then it'll be good in any other context, whether it's orchestra, rock, whatever, jazz, Latin or something. If you put it in a different tempo or time signatures and drum beats and stuff like that. So it's like having a good core is good, but for ADHD brains like me, it can be like yeah.
Well, especially if I don't know what kind of metal you grew up on, but I grew up on progressive metal.
Yeah, like Dream Theater and stuff like that. Yeah. Like once I learned what 5/8, 7/8, 9/8, 11/8, 6, like what 11, 16, or you're like, what are all these things? And it's funny when I learned about that, and then I started using Guitar Pro, because I used to use Power Tab. I don't know if you've ever used that. It doesn't really make you have to input the right time signatures. So I would just write riffs and tab stuff all the time. But once I started using Guitar Pro, I'm like, what are all these red bars? Like, what am I doing wrong? And then I was learning that I needed to insert the right time signature. But then I was figuring out like, oh, how come all these riffs are like weird time signatures? And it's like, oh, it's probably because I listened to a lot of Dream Theater, and I didn't even make that connection. It was just inspired by it. But then, you learn as you go, because I never got guitar lessons or anything. So I just kind of figured stuff out as I went, or taking little bits of time to learn basic theory, and then just like stepping away from it. Like, all right, cool. Yeah, I know what a whole tone scale is and how to make stuff sound spacey or something, or that kind of thing. But then that's where I kind of leave it.
Yeah, I feel you on that. I think I've learned and forgotten theory like 3 times in my life.
I know every time I start trying to get into jazz guitar or things like that, I catch myself, I start learning it. I'll start learning scales, but then I'll immediately start hearing ideas, and then I just start playing with it. And then I'm like, all right, cool. Like, it got me inspired to work on something. But if it's like, oh yeah, there's this like, chord progression of like jazz chords, now use that scale and play over it. Like, if I don't have it like just fully memorized on the guitar, then I'll probably be like, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'll just use my ear, which has kind of helped me along the road.
Yeah.
I kind of come at it from a similar but kind of different mindset, or kind of originally, which is I started out, one of my first instruments as a teenager was drums. And all the music that I was into, all different kinds, I started to find like there was a couple of common elements that the drums became kind of central to. And I, listening to old music, there's really just there's a couple of core sounds. There's bass, there's snare, and there's hi-hats. And, almost all music in some way is built around, I mean, other than the melodic instruments, it's around these weird core elemental concepts. So like acoustic guitar, the slap and the pick provide this hi-hat like and snare like crack and click, and then the body of it provides a lot of thump.
Very
and
percussive.
Then the bottom string really kind of brings that out. So it's where you get into really any kind of music, it's often built around, especially in the era of rock and electronic, whatever else is going on, there's this fundamental chunks of the spectrum that become like the guidelines and like the rails that the music kind of rides on. And I'd always thought, like, why is that? Thinking about like maybe, originally we would use our bodies and our voices and drum, like sticks and rocks and skins and things like that. But what is it about that? And it kind of led me to, like, with what we sample was like, okay, every library should be playable as its own. Like, you should be able to write whole songs using nothing but one library, just with all the different kind of sound effects and elements we would add. But whereas like it doesn't, like, say something to be a snare, that middle range kind of like thrust, it could be anything. It doesn't really matter that it's whether or not it's a snare drum or a drum at all. It's more like, what does it represent in your gut, in your feeling, and thinking about instruments or arrangements built around these core sort of like components, and then like a melody instrument and sort of a sub harmony instrument, like whether it's a bass guitar and a guitar, or like a tuba and a flute, things that require that interplay, but then also fill up the frequency range in these discrete areas.
Yeah.
And then learning about mixing and sort of the food groups of that, and how they all kind of fall into these roles of whatever you swap into these roles, they still remain the same. And music feels empty, or a song can feel empty, maybe on purpose. Often that's really what you want. But in a lot of cases, a proper arrangement always has these sockets filled with something.
Yeah. To piggyback on that, actually, there was something that I learned when I first started getting into orchestral music, which is exactly what you're saying, which is like, before I started learning about orchestral music and arranging for an orchestra, which I'm not sure I entirely know how to do properly still, but before that, it was all, like EQ. It was all in the mix and it was all in post-production. But then when I started to learn more about orchestral music, it was like, the principle was, when you have a live orchestra, you don't have knobs that you can turn. You don't have an EQ. So the way that you EQ, the way that you mix, is through arrangement. And the way that an orchestra is laid out is to be able to accommodate that, right? So like, if you need more high end, you're going to bring in instruments that are going to sort of occupy that space. Whereas if you need more low end, you're going to bring in instruments that are going to occupy that space. And you build your arrangement with the mix in mind, using those instruments and those sounds that occupy those frequencies as your EQ knob, and I thought that was really cool. And it forever changed the way that I thought about, digital production. It's like, get the arrangement right before you start mixing. Like, it should sound like it's mostly there, before you start going in and tweaking things in post-production.
Yeah, so. Just learning how to write for the ranges. That was like, I 100% agree, because once I started learning, because when you think like learning orchestral music, there's so much to it, and it's almost like musical chess. There's so many moves you can make that can still be right, combinations of things and stuff like that. But learning how the frequency ranges of each orchestral section, like they all can relate. They're just all timbrely different. So it's like, okay, you got tubas and tenor trombones, and it goes all the way up to trumpets, and same thing with like basses to violins. So it's like, once I kind of started understanding that, it made thinking about orchestral music a little bit easier. And it's like same thing with a band, it's like, lock that kick drum in with the bass guitar, or things like that with writing, and how that stuff can really help with just making things push more, or not adding so much low end to guitars, because bass guitars are the ones that are the low end, like you can high pass a lot of that stuff, and it's not necessary, and it'll make your mix sound so much better. And
exactly, yeah, you don't have all that mud in there.
Yeah, and all that stuff really helps, especially with just getting clarity. And then from there, you can, from there, it's a little bit easier to add on.
Yeah. In the same way that a mixing engineer will mix in post-production, the conductor of an orchestra is sort of mixing in real time.
Yeah, just like real time volume balancing. Like, all right, no, bring it back. All right, no,
okay.
take that up. Yeah,
you're a little too loud, flutes.
Yeah, going a little too ham, piccolo.
Growing up with classical music and then being in concert band and things like that, it always, especially older classical music, was always to me bewildering how you would arrange that, because it can be so complex, but not in a structured, not in the structured way we think of modern music, where you have fixed time signature, fixed tempo. I mean, speaking more to the broad, with things like jazz and progressive metal aside, where with orchestral music, time signature is used as a motive tool like anything else. You put it into like 5/8 or 11/12 or something, it's going to start to feel rushed. Or my favorite 7/8. It has this tumbling forward or this awkwardness that makes it uncomfortable or tense or driving. But with every different section, doing little pieces that, like when you think of like a flourish in an orchestra, you have flutes, fluttering, and you have, brass sweeping up and things like that. There's so many moving parts that from a listening perspective, it's like, how would you even put this together? And why would you make the choices? And where did that kind of come from? And I think what helped me to grapple with how that all works was modern soundtrack music, because it left, with like sort of the early to mid 20th century, sort of this postmodern exploration of music kind of led to, on one hand, like more alienating music, more awkward or modern, like I don't know how you describe it, but like John Cage or things like that, where it was deliberately alienating or deliberately sort of strange. Or even with somebody like Philip Glass, where it's intricate, but it's not. It's emotional when you follow it, but from the outside, it can often also be cacophonous. At least some pieces, but with modern soundtrack music, it went way more emotive, way more emotional, but on the surface emotional, really moving with the scene to make you feel what's happening on screen. And especially the way that brass and strings became this paint, this bucket of paint they would throw on pieces, where you can't help but like feel and recognize the sort of the emotional current of a piece. It was very overt, and compared to older classical music, where you could say it's peaceful, it's placid, or it's dramatic or whatever, but it wouldn't. It's like the idea of an emotion versus literally you feeling it,
right?
And I'm somebody who really feels music, and so it wasn't that I wasn't feeling things like Mozart, but I definitely feel somebody like like Hans Zimmer more. And I mean, not that I would say he's even a particular like composer that I follow specifically, but I can't deny that some of his work can be extraordinarily simple and yet like profoundly emotional when it's paired with a moment on the screen.
Yeah.
And that carries away from the screen too. So when you just hear a soundtrack, it still hits you. Either you remember the scene, or even if you haven't seen it, you recognize what it's saying. And I think that's kind of what's helped me understand how you might use an orchestra in both ways. Is like, okay, so each of these instrument sections has a role to play in the emotional content of a piece, and how you use them are to create this overall emotive construct, not just these complex theory-driven moving parts that are inscrutable and impossible to really get your head around unless you're a master or you've been trained for decades.
Yeah. Well, and to take that even further, it's like with soundtrack music, you kind of get out of that classical arrangement for orchestra, and you start to use the instruments in ways that they weren't necessarily intended to be used, to create textures that are so visceral, right? Like when you talk about the difference between Mozart and Hans Zimmer, part of the reason I think why Hans Zimmer hits better when it's paired with film is because, you know, he's doing things with those instruments and mixing them with, you know, he's doing things with those instruments that like you wouldn't really necessarily think to do to create a unique texture. The thing that comes to mind is the theme song for the Joker with the sort of never-ending note that continues to rise while the other note kind of stays. What's that?
Was it like a shepherd's tone?
It was on a cello, a shepherd's tone. Is
where
that what
the note, it's like the melody continues to rise infinitely by overlapping back and bottom.
No, I think it's like where it's like it's a single note, but then he records it again, but it just keeps like slightly going out chromatic. So you just hear this like
it's this tension,
yeah.
And he's trying to create this thing where it's like you're the feeling that you're sort of like winding a wire, and it's getting more and more tense, and it's getting more and more tense, but it never breaks, kind of thing. And that's just something that you don't hear people doing. And then he goes and he mixes it with synthesizers and things like that too. So it's this cool, like when you get into film score and you know, soundtrack music, you start getting into this cool sort of experimentation world. I always think about, you know, Trent Reznor and their scores, and like their whole thing is they're sitting there like dropping ashtrays on synths and like hitting them with hammers and stuff like that, and just doing weird stuff to create this visceral feeling that isn't necessarily, like you said, driven by music theory or you know, melodic structure or anything like that, but it's more about capturing an emotion than it is about, you know, or a feeling than it is about capturing a piece of music that's impressive to listen to.
Yeah, especially just building sound palettes, because I remember hearing Charlie Clouser talk about how they would just be sitting and just making samples, making drum samples, you know, stuff that isn't necessarily just like, oh, let's just record a drum set, but, you know, taking these and putting them through pedals and doing all these crazy processes, and it's crazy how his music has always been so cinematic, but also very simple. Like I was thinking about that, Mike, when you were talking about Philip Glass and John Cage, like these people who at the core just create this very dense emotional music, but still very simple. Even hearing, you know, Johnny Cash covering, you know, his stuff, and it's just at the core of it's just super simple, you know. But when you listen to the original of Hurt, it's, you know, you hear this like weird record winding in the background, and just it's kind of dissonant guitar, and you hear these notes. It's like, why it doesn't quite sound right, but it's still at the core. It has this very triggering, emotional type of sound, and I love that kind of stuff.
I think about, well, I mean, looking back at older classical music, and you know, way back when, you know, you had medieval music, which was, you know, small arrangements, and it was, you know, like sort of modern folk music, but then for its day, and it kind of, you know, as classical music, the way we think of it with big orchestras, that became like an expression and an evolution of that was built around wealth and prestige. You know, musicians that were trained in these, you know, very specific schools in Europe, and were really only enjoyed and experienced by aristocrats, like people in that echelon of society that could afford to even dress to be allowed into, say, a concert hall like that. You'd have some music that was performed publicly, but not really that kind of music, not at that scale. You know, I think there was some, you know, the edges of it where sort of more of the common man might be able to experience it, but until recorded music, the symphony wasn't really something that most people would ever really get to hear. until you could actually play it back. And also, I think it became more common, for music to for classical and orchestra music, especially in the 1800s, to be accessible, because there began to be more of the musicians and more composers, and it just became more and more of an experience. But music wasn't at that time still driven by the zeitgeist as specifically as it is now. And what I mean by that now is, if you were to play, like, what would be a good example? I mean, say Talking About Hurt, with that airy noise in the background, and the just slightly dissonant guitars and things like that. The feelings that you get when you listen to that as a person of this era, you hear in it echoes and references to other music and things that are going on in culture, that you'd have to be of this time to really understand what is that even about. Like, music today, the reason, like, say Hans Zimmer, doing that, say with the Joker theme, to even understand why that would be a good thing to hear, why it's pleasing to hear, or pleasing in a weird way, in the same way that a horror movie can be pleasing. It scratches an itch that somebody 150, 200 years ago, it would just sound like noise to them. It would sound awful.
It was an itch that they didn't have to scratch.
But like a billion people on Earth now would all kind of get that, even if they haven't seen that movie. But we all are now soaked in a modern idea of music as self-referential, interreferential between different eras and different aesthetics and memes that sort of like define. I know I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but think about modern dubstep and the way that it uses, or even the newer kinds of music that are even weirder, where they're using literal sound bites from memes, from videos, as core components of the music. And when you hear that, even if you think, oh, that's cacophony, you still recognize those elements, and you get that tiny dose of like that feeling of recognition. And what does that mean? What is that a meme about? And why am I supposed to feel that in this song? And I think, to me, that is really interesting, because it's sort of like anybody could be the person that is the subject of, or the creator of a meme that in some weird way could then find its way into music that would then be experienced and then recognized by billions of people. And then that becomes a new component of music that will again be referenced or played upon by a different composer or future musicians. And it's sort of like we all are sort of part of this meta music evolution that didn't used to exist in the same way. Like that the average person feels a personal connection to so many different components and parts of music that I don't think was really possible before. And I think that's really what seems to be driving this hyper evolution of music, and the way that it kind of ricochets around now between different genres. Even I don't know, I don't know quite how to put that into words better, but there's something about music now beyond just what technologically has become possible with electronic music and with things like sample libraries and virtual instruments that make these really complicated to create kinds of music suddenly very accessible. Like classical music.
I mean, I wonder, there's probably so many different elements that go into that, right? Like the idea that way back in the day, exploring different musical approaches or genres or whatever you want to call it, different pieces of music were probably new territory. Whereas the idea of today, it's like you can't, no matter what, you're not going to make anything that's completely 100% original, because everything's kind of been done, right? To some degree. And everything is sort of just a repackaging or your take on the things that you've heard over the years. Like there was a point in time where there wasn't every genre in the world that you grew up hearing in your ears. Also, the idea that there's just so many more people making music now, right? And content and all of this stuff. It's like there's so much more information to digest today than there was back in the medieval times or even in Mozart's time. You know, back then it's like they mostly had the sounds of nature, the sounds of society, and whatever was going on around them, but they didn't have the internet or Netflix or memes to think about or any of that stuff. Like, if you dropped someone from that world into today, they would probably die of shock.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's that Tim and Eric meme with theirs just like
Yeah. And just so think about like the information, like, because in my opinion, music and art generally is just a synthesizing of whatever it is that you're absorbing. And just the sheer amount of information that we absorb on a daily basis, even if we're not trying to now, is just so different than the amount of information that was absorbed back then. So it's like you probably can't even help but to sort of digest and synthesize memes and synthesize, you know, a society that's based on just infinite information and connection in ways that honestly I'm not sure that we were meant to be able to handle and digest and synthesize.
Yeah. I think too, it's the way that it's evolving faster and faster. If I'm going to talk about futurism for a second.
Yeah.
And when we were kids, at least when I was a kid, it was in the 70s. And at that moment, there was a huge wave of futurism in sci-fi that was trying to project what the future was really going to look like, say, in 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
They thought, in 40 years from then, you'd have Blade Runner.
Yeah,
right?
we're supposed to have hoverboards right now. I'm still waiting for mine.
Right?
Yeah, I think we died in Terminator like 10 years ago or something.
Yeah, like cities on Mars. But the idea was in all of this stuff. I remember there was like a few episodes of Buck Rogers that like there would be like a futuristic dance club, and the music was I don't even know how to describe it. It was like beeps and boops, like electronic, but not like it was like it was what they thought the future would be, and it was just like kind of clangy, dissonant, really simple, very synthesizer, very theremin-esque, like but then like do like and then there was like in Star Wars there was the cantina music, and this idea that in the future either the music would become very like sort of clanky, janky, kind of like very silly, or very slick, very like, and we thought that like it was going to become more and more sterile, entirely synthesizer based, and very much as close as they could get to just a pure sine wave. If you really think in the way that in the 70s everybody thought the future would be gleaming white and sleek, but what we instead have with music now is every possible combination, sometimes in the same song. Like if you think about like current trap music, and more particularly like sort of the kind of mumblecore styles of it, where you barely understand what they're saying, where the music, the pitch is all over the place, but it's crafted in the level at the level of precision as say something like dubstep, but where they're really like messing with the auditory experience of it. It starts to feel like you're high, right? Starts to feel like you're like something's not all there. But it's also, when you really think about the music, it's not badly produced, it's weirdly produced. Like the future we're in now, as music continues to progress, then that echoes into like country music now, like has some of these elements, right?
Oh yeah.
The very cutting edge of country music is this like sort of like you have music stars with facial tattoos and SoundCloud accounts and composing with trap, beats and production styles, and in the far end of that you have electronic musicians with full orchestras mixed in. and like where you can go from like hard sort of rhythmic music to pure atmospheric in the same the same composer, sometimes the same song. It's that anything is permitted, anything is possible, and it becomes like this, that the genre within a song becomes just another instrument in the arrangement, in that the genre you choose or the way you construct it is really just another way of getting across an emotion. And that in this modern era, music, rather than becoming streamlined or simple or perfected, is actually mutated in every possible direction. So when we think from now, will the future then 100 years from now be that pure sine wave, like very crystally zoom kind of music, or will it even be more bizarre?
Yeah, I mean, well, that brings up an interesting question, because it, when you think about the sort of future looking of the sterilization of music, I think that was a word that you used that really kind of like stuck with me. Maybe in some ways, like, music hasn't been sterilized to a simple sine wave, a pure sine wave. But I mean, how do you guys feel about in terms of like music being sterilized into commodified, productized, sellable units? In terms of at least what's supported in a general sense. This kind of gets to a larger conversation about just capitalism and the commodification of everything. But I feel like for me, yes, while music has gotten more sort of genre explorative, and country music has dubstep elements or hip hop elements, and hip hop stars are winning the best country song at the Grammys or whatever. There's all this genre swapping happening in this exploration about things, but also there's this weird sort of homogenization of music, to where I feel like the spectrum in a lot of ways seems to be getting smaller and smaller and smaller, at least in terms of what's consumed on a large scale. How do you guys feel about that? What's your opinion about sort of modern music, and in terms of like the homogenization of maybe not sound, but emotion and expression of the human in music, if that makes sense?
I think that there's always been two tracks in music.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're still alive today. When I think about the 80s, on one hand, you had punk, you had the sort of the genesis of industrial music.
Yeah.
You had underground electronica, which we think of, like, say, house music now as like very white bread, mainstream, clean cut. But back then it was like, basically illegal music. Trance and house really weren't things you would experience in a upstanding kind of environment, especially since disco had been like banished. And so you had this underground side of music, and then you had this very mainstream side, say hair metal bands.
Mm-hmm.
And there was always this revulsion from a lot of musicians and music fans from both the music, that mainstream music, or and pop, and you had this same in electronic music in the 80s. You had the very pop friendly stuff, and then you had the very much less friendly stuff, and there was this tension. And I grew up in that tension. I got into like alt rock and grunge bands and industrial music and all that, because I hated pop music at the time.
Mm-hmm.
In my old age now, I am very much more, I don't mind it anywhere near as much, because now I feel like you can explore different elements of music and human expression in a lot of ways. But at the time I was like, fuck all that shit. I mean, bring it all down. And I think that has always existed, because that same profit motive was there, especially, you know, in the 70s and 80s when the music industry, the record industry was at its most codified, structured, sort of like monopolized system. The labels dominated music and got to decide what got made, and everything else had to come out on tape or, you know, be pirated or traded around. You know, and then with the internet, that kind of like both destroyed the record industry and made it easier for things to spread and cross-pollinate. And suddenly you could afford to be into 10 different genres and have 20 different favorite bands because you didn't have to pick and choose.
Sure.
You could consume whole albums instead of just singles, and you wouldn't even necessarily listen to the radio anymore. You'd find your own, and you talk to your friends and trade, and all of that sort of broke down that wall, and led to, in some ways, this homogenization, this cross-pollination between different genres and artists, and a lot of crossovers. And, you know, over the last 20, 30, like you had like Aerosmith and Run DMC in like the, I guess late 80s.
Mm-hmm.
When was that? I don't think it was in the early 90s. It was late 80s.
Yeah.
That was like, you know, a crossover that's easy to remember as sort of a benchmark, although there have been plenty before, of course. But now it's so standard to have crossover artists across different genres, like, you know, pop artists on hip hop records, hip hop artists on rock records, or individual artists that will do different genres. And so, like you said, this melting pot has become more of a gray in a lot of ways. And a lot of that has been reconsumed by this new resurgent music industry that doesn't have the form of the old record labels, but it has the marketing engine behind it. Somebody like, like Taylor Swift is an industry in and of herself. Like, yes, with, you know, entire corporate structure around the marketing and distribution and promotion of that, and the knock-on effects that has on the genre of pop music at large, where everything becomes kind of a constellation around these big artists that sort of dominate the concept of what is pop music and what is marketable. And while that shapes, you know, a good portion of sort of pop culture in the same way that pop music in its very controlled form used to in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, where it was decided by very few people what all of us would hear. That's still in a way the case now, because, you know, as always, capitalism finds those unique elements, feeds on them, and learns how to extract the value and reduce that value in the same process of doing that. It still has we still have the whole underground side of things. And still a lot of that underground is driven by either practicality, in the same way that punk bands, a lot of times you were into punk not because you were a punk, but because you couldn't afford better instruments, and there you couldn't afford better recording. You know, you had a 4-track or a 2-track. You had like an old tape machine, and that's what you do your demo on. And so, by virtue of fidelity, you were a punk band because you couldn't tell the difference between you and a punk band because you didn't know what you were doing. I'm not saying that to denigrate punk. That's not that at all. And, you know, that is a specific art style, and there are still a ton of people who make 4-track music. Yeah. For that reason, because of that aesthetic. But the practical reality of how that became the way it did, and, you know, the same way now that you have a lot of, you know, producers now who started out with not just Fruity Loops, but like EJ or all these other really limited tools to make music, and then became, you know, but because they were good at what they were doing and innovative, it became a style in and of itself that influenced others. So now people are trying to replicate these limits or aspiring to them because the artists they grew up on sounded like that.
Yeah.
And so I think you still have this underground that is creating all this polyphony, all this creative chaos. And when I say bizarre, I mean like in the market sense of it, just every kind of thing imaginable is coexisting or forming little pockets. And the mainstream keeps trying to feed back off of that. But in doing so, creates this backlash that creates these new opportunities. I think streaming, for example, the idea that independent artists could make a living has always had this up and down, where for a minute you couldn't, and then, and suddenly in the 90s you could hit all these new indie artists, and they were touring, or, all these little sub labels they could make a living off of more than they could in the past. Right. And then suddenly that died again with streaming, right? Where now it's basically impossible for the average working musician to really make that their whole job, unless they're really lucky or they have a long track record and a lot of contacts, etc. And streaming has really nullified that, as because you're not going to make anything off streaming, really. Even big artists can't do that. And so they've gone back to selling merch. They've gone back to touring.
Well, and there's all these other elements of how you can make music, or how you can make money as a musician today, which includes things like being a content creator and, brand deals and sponsorships and things like that. You have to kind of diversify. Like it's almost impossible to make money off of just making music and releasing music. Like that day and age is pretty much gone. Yeah.
But I think, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it's like the skills required to be a successful musician isn't just, it goes, like you're saying, like so far beyond just making music, which is already, hard by itself, to make something that talks to millions of people or thousands of people or whatever. And it's just, it's so much harder. You have to be way more creative, because it's crazy how before people were using the internet as a means of getting out there, because before it was just finding the right person to see you and then put you on this platform to be able to be seen by thousands and thousands of people. And then you had the MySpace era, which I remember, when you're, put some music, your band could put demos on MySpace and
make your custom MySpace page.
Yeah, and you could reach out to bands, because before it was going to shows and tape trading or giving CDs and demos to your favorite bands, and or give them a shirt. Maybe someone will see them wearing your shirt and be like, "Oh, who's that band?" Or it's just networking in real time. And then I remember seeing bands just like, "Who's this band?" And they got thousands of listens on MySpace. And then you have a friend like, "Hey, let's go there. Let's go to the show, the showcase or something." All right, cool. And then it's just packed. And you're like, "Dude, I've never heard of this band, and they're from Riverside. Like, how is this band so huge now?" And then so you had that era where it was a lot easier because there wasn't so much noise. And now it's almost the opposite. Before it was hard to get people to see you because you just don't really have a platform. Now everyone has a platform, and it's hard to be seen.
Yeah,
and that's the crazy thing now, where everything from how you're promoting yourself, how you're making content, how you're, because the brand deals and, influencer marketing and things like that, now that everyone's doing that, everyone has to be even more creative, or you just have to have, a personality, or, like, it's not necessarily about like who's the best, but being sort of an authoritative figure in your niche or whatever it is. So it's like, if you're a drummer, and you're comfortable talking on camera, but you're really good, and you find a way to kind of integrate all these things together to build a following and have people want to pay you to promote their products, and that's cool. But there's just so many avenues now, or now everyone's doing courses, or I want to make a course on this, but then there's so much information. I mean, that's where it's like, okay, I have a fan base, and they're going to buy the course because either they really want to learn, or they like the way that I do things, and they want to dive in deeper past just the surface level information that you provide. But in this stage, I don't know, man, I feel weird, because there's times I've thought about that. Like, because I remember when I was first working on an album and learning music production, as I was learning, I was making YouTube videos. So as I was learning, like, this is how you can get less latency on your guitar while tracking, because there was always this thing, but there's these like little tips I would learn, and I would share it. Or this is how I go about routing, tune track drums in my DAW, or, to be able to mix each individual thing. Or so, I mean, now people will probably sell you a whole course on it, but market it in a way to where it's like, this is the whole end all be all holy grail of how to go from start to finish in a music production.
Right.
But if you're savvy enough, you'll find the information, but it's just a lot of it requires a lot more legwork, which I think people just don't have the attention span to do anymore. Like me, I feel like I internalize information much better when I've done the work. And I think that's probably just because maybe it's because I was born in 85 and I wasn't born in 2006, and I just don't have an attention span, for like, everyone wants things so fast. It's kind of like when we were talking about the whole music thing and how everything's so accessible. I kind of miss the days when things were a little bit harder to get your hands on.
Absolutely.
I feel like going to the store, having your parent buy you an album, taking it back, opening it up, putting in your CD player, looking at the booklet, like reading the lyrics and seeing who the band's thanking and who worked on the record. And it's like you take it in more now. It's just like, wait, what was that band? I don't know. I forget. I'll add it to I'll love it and add it to my Spotify playlist or that sort of thing. But people are like, I don't even know who did that song. It's just a good song.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's like the way that music is consumed now is entirely different than the way that music used to be consumed when we were younger, right? Like listening to an album used to be a primary experience. You would go and you would buy the album. Maybe you'd get your friends together, or maybe you would just kind of put on some headphones by yourself, but you would sit down and you listen to that album from start to finish, and you would look at the booklet. It was a piece of art like a movie or a TV show where you sat and you were present with it and engaged with it, and it engaged with you. Now it's exactly what you're saying, where it's sort of this like passive secondary thing, where it's something that you have going on in the background while you're doing other stuff, like, a lot of times listening to a podcast would be, right? While you're vacuuming or getting ready to go out or something like that. But I think this ties into what you were saying, Mike, because I agree with you in that there's always been the mainstream and the underground. And like you guys, I was always the underground. I was always like, fuck the mainstream. Sorry, I don't know if you guys curse on this podcast. Okay, cool.
Not often.
Fuck the mainstream. It's all about the underground. The underground is where the expression and the emotion is, and the mainstream is just sort of capitalist, like sterile music or whatever, like we were talking about. But and maybe this is a result of me growing up in the 90s, being a product of the 90s. But I feel like the distance between the mainstream and the underground is so much bigger today than it was when I was a kid. Because while there was, like Backstreet Boys, there was also Korn, and both of them were on MTV. While there was
Total
Britney
Request
Spears,
Live.
Yeah, exactly. They're both on TRL. And there was, I think, also, because of the way that music was consumed, there was a lot more sort of monoculture involved in it. So a lot more community involved in the people that liked Korn, or the people that liked Tool, or the people that liked, Soundgarden, or whatever the sort of underground bands were at the time. There was enough community and enough sort of monoculture around all of it that they were able to actually become the mainstream, and I think that sort of, like, I don't know that I think that I have this theory that the last, like, great interesting bands that will sort of live on forever kind of stopped, like, they formed in the 90s and early 2000s, and after that, it's only really going to be individual pop stars. But like when I think about Tom York and Radiohead, and I think about what you're saying, Craig, in terms of all of the things that you need to do to be a musician, or to make money, to have a career as a musician today, like, Tom York would not be recording YouTube videos. From what I know about him, like, as he's learning or exploring things, he's not going to be like recording YouTube videos and sharing that kind of thing. That's not his thing. His thing is, he's kind of an introverted dude, and he likes to explore by himself and with a trusted group of people. And I wonder, like, with sort of the changes in the way music is consumed and now the way music is also distributed, it's sort of created this weird competitive thing in music where now if you're an artist and you're trying to make a name for yourself, it's not necessarily about making the best, most expressive, honest music for yourself. It's about making music that can stand out above the noise and compete on Spotify, or content that can compete on YouTube and satisfy the algorithm. It's almost like there's, yes, like you were saying, Craig, like there's never been as much of a platform for as many people to be able to put their music out. But those platforms have their own sort of gatekeepery, like they have their own requirements that need to be met. Mm-hmm. And that really completely shapes the type of content or music or art or whatever that you're going to put out, because it needs to satisfy those requirements for that algorithm, or for the way that people consume music today and all of that kind of stuff. And so it's like this weird thing where, yes, the underground still exists, but I feel like it's so much further underground than it used to be, at least in my memory. And I'm not sure that, at least in the next sort of immediate future, that we're going to see that underground peek through into the mainstream in the same ways that maybe it did in the 90s or the 80s or the 70s or the 60s.
I think that's true. I guess, all right, so I would dissect that a little bit, in that in the 80s or 90s, you know, there would be maybe an potential audience pool of maybe 500 million for the biggest pop stars between
Sure.
Europe and the United States and Asia, where there was that crossover. And even then it would be segmented, but say somebody like Michael Jackson, you know, maybe would reach at the height of his career at that time. I mean, obviously since then he's reached far more people, mm-hmm. but at that time there were maybe 500 million people he could touch directly. Like, that would potentially even be able to hear his music, given technology, media, and all that, and how even at that time internationally there was a lot more compartmentalization in terms of each nation's pop culture and that influence. And now it's essentially all 8 or so billion of us that can, you know, be exposed to or consume a lot of the same content. Obviously there are points of isolation, but it's there more than it ever has been. And so the mainstream, though, still is this small set of corporations. You know, or the mainstream, I guess, is mediated by these corporations. The main labels still exist in a certain form under these massive umbrella corporations, Time Warner, you know, like I don't even know who owns them all now. Like, all the different the major labels are now part of these conglomerates. I guess Disney controls a huge portion of the music catalog, and all this stuff. And of course, these streaming platforms get to shape interest. And when something does put up above the mainstream, you know, it feasts upon that for a while and then moves on. But these sub communities still exist in fairly large numbers compared to the way it was back then. It just, now that's a drop in a much bigger bucket.
Yeah.
The kind of for example, this sort of the genre of like content creator I really like a lot of is like basically gearheads and field recording sort of hobbyists. And that's really, you know, on YouTube and on Reddit, those really have they're not so gatekept as they used to be. There's a lot of cross-pollination, a lot of independent channels that I they seem, their production elevates and elevates, and I think a lot of them do that for a living, or certainly at least more and more so as they're doing other things. I think one thing that you touched on, where you have to do, like, if you're in a band, you have to do YouTube videos, you have to do all these other things, like influencer stuff, brand review stuff. In a way, back in the day when we were in bands, we had to do things very similarly. We had to do things like go on like college radio or try to get our stuff on mainstream radio. We had to go out and do shows. We had to sell merch. We did care about how others, even in our genre, would feel about us. Like, are we a poser or not, right? Or what?
Absolutely, yeah.
I want to, I got to learn this cover song so that the kids who are going to come out to my show recognize me as one of them, and therefore they might listen to my music or something like that. There was all these tasks that you had to do back then, struggling to make it for the same number of people you could reach now, but having to do this other kind of stuff. So like now you do have to care about getting a pretty decent camera to do video content for YouTube. You have to, if you do make music, you have to make a music video, even if it's just a, visualizer type of, animated background, not a proper music video. You still have to do all these other things. They're just new other things.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of driven by what the technology and the zeitgeist sort of force and allow at the same time.
I think a slight difference there, though, is that those other things that you had to do, back when we were touring in vans or whatever, had to do with your music. They were an extension of, your music, your expression, the thing that you were making and trying to put out into the world. Now, when you have to make a YouTube channel, if you just make a YouTube channel that's all about your music, forget about it. Nobody's interested in that. Yeah. YouTube's all about giving value to people and leaving people better than they were when they came across your video, right? Whether that's they're walking away with some kind of catharsis, some kind of information that they didn't have before, you've taught them something, you've entertained them with something, and it's so much more broad and general than it is about you. If your YouTube channel is about you and your music, nobody cares.
Yeah.
So like now there are all of these other things that, a lot of artists that I know today that I've worked with in my marketing and stuff like that, their entire career around music is around making music for things that aren't theirs, making music either to promote a product or to do a thing or whatever. And what they end up having is they end up having a hard time setting aside time to actually work on something that's entirely theirs, right? And to work on, a single or an album or whatever it is, because all of their time is spent trying to just like pay rent by doing product videos or whatever it is that you might be doing. So there is a difference, I think, in the other things like making posters or doing photo shoots or making merch or, going on the road for a month or 2 months at a time. That's all stuff that you're doing in service of your goal and your art versus, and I'm not trying to be like, holier than thou about this, and say like, oh, back in my day and kids these days and like, be all get off my Lonnie about it. But like, I'm just trying to point out the differences, I think, in being an artist today versus being an artist when we were growing up and what those sort of satellite things were that you had to do.
I definitely agree. I think I guess that's what, in this era where there are a, million times more independent artists than there were when we were growing up, simply because there can be. I mean, literally a million times more, because I don't know that there were a million recording artists in the 80s, but now there are probably 100 million recording artists now today, like literally, or more, because anybody can kind of do it more than they ever could. Certainly at a fidelity and quality level better than you could do in the 80s, just point blank. Literally anybody with a smartphone can do that now. They don't do that, but they can do that. So, But so there are so many more, and so there's so much music out there, and a lot of it, of course, just becomes this soup of very derivative or similar stuff. And there, as there's always been, everybody amongst them dreams of making that their thing, or just loves it to the point where they certainly wouldn't mind it if their music took off. And there are definitely, so many that really struggle and try. And it is still shitty to have to spend a lot of that time on work peripheral to that just to support it, especially if you still also have to have a day job.
Yeah.
Or a gig work or things like that. So while on certain hand, on one hand, there's more technical opportunity and capability for the average person, it's also so much more difficult to break through all that noise.
Yeah. I think it's sort of like 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other, right? It's like back in the day or whatever. Sure, maybe you didn't have the ability to go into a studio or the funds to go into a studio and record a nice record. Sure, maybe the ability to get your music out to people in the form of recorded music was harder, but you could also put together a band and go play shows and, hop into a car or a van or whatever and drive around and have a captive audience of anywhere between one person and 100 people or whatever the cap of the club and whoever showed up. Today, yes, there are more platforms that you can technically put your music out on, or that you can technically get your art out on, but there's so much more noise. And so, getting that in front of people and the chance of people hearing it is actually pretty low. Or any substantial number of people hearing it is actually pretty low, unless you're sort of competing with other artists for algorithmic priority on Spotify or YouTube or whatever. But also, and I love music tech. I love the way that music tech has evolved over the years. I mean, look, if DAWs didn't exist and music tech didn't exist in the form that it is right now, I wouldn't be able to make the music that I make. And I'm really proud of some stuff that I've done. And so I'm super grateful to it. At the same time, it's sort of led to this thing of music becoming a much more individual thing that people do by themselves and alone, rather than getting their group of 3 or 4 people together and going and working it out, sweating their asses off in a garage. And not saying, again, that one is better than the other, but in the idea that back in the day, if you couldn't get your music distributed, you could still put together a band and go out and play shows. Most artists I know today have never performed live, ever. Their whole grind is just making music in isolation by themselves and trying desperately to, be competitive in the sort of algorithmic landscape that we live in now. And this is my holier than thou thing. I think you lose a lot when music is an entirely isolated experience for you, because I think that music at its core is meant to be a collaborative thing. When we first started, stretching, skins over hollow pieces of wood and making drums and making music, it was a communal, collaborative thing. There's something, that saying that music is an international language. Well, that depends on it. That's sort of predicated on it being this collaborative thing. It's an international language that you share and you speak with other people. So when you're sitting in a room by yourself and isolated, it's like a lot of the artists I know are like, they're super depressed. Not that artists haven't always been depressed, but like
it's a different kind of depression.
It's a different kind of depression. It's not Chris Cornell depression. They're super lonely and they just spend all of their time in a room by themselves. Not like, for me, I really miss playing in a band, mostly because I'm only as good as my own limitations, right? I'm only as good as my own ideas. And so if I get stuck on something, the way I'm going to find my way out of it is the way that I know how to find my way out of it. But I don't get the benefit of the drummer who grew up on an entirely different diet of music, or the bass player who comes from a jazz background but is, for some reason playing in this rock band with me. Hearing the idea that we've brought in and going like, oh, you know what? I hear this. To me, that's what makes music really beautiful and multi-layered. That's why I think like the sort of the last great bands or whatever were like the 90s, 2000s, because increasingly over time, music has become this more sort of individual pursuit. And so you don't get, a Radiohead, or you don't get a Queens of the Stone Age, or you don't get, these other bands that are really not the result of like one person's brilliance, but the result of a collaboration and a coming together of elements that are greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the way music is made, the way music is distributed, and the way music is consumed, that missing piece of music, it just sort of inherently changes what music is. It kind of makes it so that it can only be less, I don't know, exploratory, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm being a little bit monolithic here, but it's, I don't know if you guys kind of get where I'm going with this.
No, I agree 100%, especially because I agree, especially coming from both of, types of, playing in bands. Because I remember I think some of my funnest times playing, not only even when just playing with your friends and jamming cover songs, like everyone goes home and kind of, they're learning Metallica, and then like we'll all get together and someone will kind of figure out the drums or then you'll swap, like, oh, you play guitar, I'll play drums, that kind of thing, to just, because I remember like the first band I was ever in, it was, all friends of mine, we were all kind of playing guitar together. We had one friend who was really good, and then me and my other childhood friend who grew up on wrestling and stuff, who eventually got into more music more seriously. All we had was 2 guitars and a singer, and we would practice. That's how we would jam. Like we'd write songs, but then I remember like when we got a drummer, and then actually hearing drum parts played with the songs. I remember it was like one of the most exciting things for me, because it's like, wow, it sounds like a song now.
Yeah, it's a whole new thing.
Of like I never even really thought what the drums would sound like to this riff, or that kind of thing. And then hearing stuff come together, and that just being some of the funnest things, or just showing up to practice, plug in, you're just playing some riff you've been jamming on that you think sounds cool, and then drummer is like, he's paying attention to you, but you don't even know that he's paying attention to you, and he starts doing some weird Latin fusion drum groove over it, and you're like, whoa, 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 what was that? Like, I didn't even, like, try that again. Like those little inspirational musical sparks that form songs, and you have that more of a connection to it because you wrote it with your buddies. Versus like that proud, like, yeah, I wrote this whole thing. Because I did the other opposite, where I was like, I just want to try and explore something on my own. And now, even that I've done that, the next one that I want to do, I actually want to collaborate more with people, or at least have other people record on it or something, just so it brings a little bit of that feeling back. Because it does, after a while, it's kind of like, all right, cool, I did that, but it feels like there's something missing.
Yeah, I've been every EP that I've released since 2015 has been completely done by myself, and dude, I am so bored of myself. Like, I'm so bored of my own ideas now. I want someone to come in and do something that I absolutely, and it's made me like a weird control freak too when it comes to music. And it's like I am not desperate, but I really, really want someone to do something or come up with an idea that I would never come up with in 1,000 years, to make me think about something differently. You know what I mean? And also, I think that if you've never had the experience, like as a musician, this is just a stupid old man thing for me to say, or old person thing for me to say, but like, if you've never had the experience of fighting with another person over a creative idea, and then and then coming to a conclusion, You know what I mean? Or finding either being convinced that their idea is better, convincing them that your idea is better, or better yet,
finding a way to
middle ground.
Yeah.
Then you're missing a huge part of one of the best parts about making music is the compromises that you have to make, and also like having your mind and your boundaries expanded.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
It's just like any relationship, even with a boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, or whatever. It's like you can think your whole life you were right, and then you just have someone. Well, actually, you do this thing all the time. It's like, oh wow, I never really realized that. But it's like until you're in any kind of relationship where you have someone that makes you think about something, either yourself or an idea or whatever, from an outside perspective, where you can find someone who gave you the right combination of words to actually trigger like I never really heard anyone say it like that, or that kind of thing. That's how you grow. I mean, I agree. It's the same thing with because you always hear people say being in a band's like being in a relationship. It's like to a degree, yes.
Yes.
But yeah, because it's like, especially if you're in a band, it's like your brothers, like I've almost gotten fist fights with band members and stuff, but I've also had some of the funnest times of my life with band members, and I've grown a lot as a musician. I remember when I first, joined some bands, it's like I had certain things that I did, but I also learned a lot, or we all learn from each other, musical ideas. Like I never really thought about doing stuff that way. And yeah, it's very easy to get bored or depressed when you're just kind of working on your own thing, unless you're really taking a lot of time to develop as a musician by either learning or watching videos where someone inspires you, or listening to music. But there's also just that being in a room with someone and just riffing.
Yeah.
And then leaving like stoked. Yeah, man, that was awesome, or whatever. It's like there's a lot of times I've gotten happy about something I worked on here, but I don't know. It doesn't really resonate as long as it does when you meet an old bandmate that you were in a band with 15 years ago. Dude, I can't believe we did that. That was super cool. It's like I don't know. It feels a little more special, I think, in that way.
Yeah. I mean, do you ever send like old songs back and forth to your bandmates, just like because it either popped in your head and you hadn't listened to it in years, or you're like scrolling through your iTunes or whatever, and you're like, holy shit, like, and then you send it to one of your old bandmates, you're like, dude, that was fun.
Yeah, sometimes I'll see stuff pop up where it'll be like, oh, this something you're tagged in. This album came out 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And then I'll just shoot him a text, or like when I used to drive a lot, I'd call him like, man, like, yeah, it just got me thinking, like, hey, what's up? Like, how's it going? Like, checking in on people or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's crazy when you think about stuff, and especially just how fast time goes. I'm just like, I'll see things pop up, little reminders on Facebook. This posted 9 years ago. I'm just like, 9 years ago? Where the hell is the last 9 years gone?
Yeah.
And, and that's what makes you like really think. Just you got to really pay attention to the journey and enjoy that. I think everyone's so living in a fast-paced world of trying to like be caught in the hustle and grind that no one's really taking the time to just like sit and enjoy or whatever. That's the thing I think where like, especially with all this AI stuff where everything's moving so fast, I think eventually something's going to break and everyone's just going to be like, I got to take it back. I think everything reaches a point where it just needs to like shut down and just get back to the basics of just why we do everything.
That seems to come in viral waves when there is that sort of like repositioning. It's happened a number of times, usually around the breaking of a new technology, like CDs when they came out, or MP3s and MySpace when that became possible for bands. It suddenly forced a re-reckoning and a change in mindset. So I want to kind of end off though on a positive note around this, about where so many of the old ways are dead as a musician, to express yourself and to get out there, even as you have every tool you could imagine, so much more within reach. I think areas that I've been inspired with lately are, like, to some extent, bands or musicians who have built these other channels where it's not just about their music, but about all the things that they're interested in, and that the commonality and community that that they sort of straddle and are interested in. And so it creates this overlap, and people come to consume that whole thing as sort of an artistic expression of that creator, along with their music. One, two, I think there's been a rise, there's been a long, slow rise in streamers over on Twitch, on YouTube. Really, I think more than anything, those two, but there are other platforms, but where bands have done live shows, in their bedroom, but like with a live audience that can kind of grow. And I think that really is a great opportunity for people to do, is to, especially because once they've done it, it's still available there in full fidelity for people to find it later. Where musicians and bands can do live performances, like right where they're at in their comfortable environment, and still have a worldwide audience. And maybe at first it's a trickle of people, but it can build. And then a lot of times they'll have guests on, or they're like things like this, where we collaborate across sort of like domains, and because we have those common experiences and threads, and where you have, so think about podcasts having each other on as guests. And I think also, so musicians can do the same and build off that same, and also bring in their other interests, or the, this is how we produce what we do. And like, let's do a tutorial about, like, break down one of our songs and how we did it, for example, where it means they have to do more of this auxiliary stuff in a new way. And then on the side of it, where it's like, okay, how do you broadcast that to a wider audience when they're not going to just be looking for your band? I think that there's been an increase and potential for much bigger increase in radio hours. Basically live streams that then become permanent, where you have curators that bring together all this different music and create a playlist, oftentimes mixed with visual media. I think a really interesting example I think people should check out is the NTS Night Shift radio hour, and another one, the Elephant Graveyard radio hour, where it's like audio visual media blended together, but what really drives it is a curated playlist of really cool music all over the place, all over the spectrum, but into this kind of linear shared experience that you're, where you don't get to choose what's played. You're listening to essentially a DJ craft a playlist for you and an overall experience for you. And often it's done live with a bunch of people listening, and they'll comment, their shared experience of it. When they hear a reference or see something, they'll talk about it. And so I think those kinds of, revisitations of these old formats like radio, but in a new way, I think are really a real opportunity for bands. Whether or not they individually start their own little radio hours, or podcasts that are essentially built around that, around the shared experience. I think there are ways of getting back at what made those sort of modalities work for their era. It wasn't just because that's what technology allowed. It really was because that's how people, like you said, it's communal, and we want a communal experience. And so it becomes necessary to find a way to give that communal experience to people in the current morass we're in, kind of this doldrum of culture where everything is changing and nothing is changing. Everything is making noise, and therefore nothing is making noise. And we're all kind of just tossed back and forth in this churn. Maybe that there are these, opportunities for bands to work together with other bands to do shows or streams together, where there are no more venues. They've all closed, or realistically they've closed. You can't just go out and find a venue in your town and play a show at full volume anymore. Maybe you can busk on the sidewalk or do a coffee shop, but it's nothing like it used to be. So many of the venues have closed, or they'll have just cover bands. I mean, which have always been there, but like, I think of all the venues that you used to be in a band and to go play, and kids would show up, versus now where that's so much more difficult. But maybe there are new ways of doing that.
Yeah. And to your point, I know I'm sitting here being all finger waggy and saying like, oh, you have to compete with the algorithms and stuff like that. But
You do.
It's just the
yeah,
nature of the game now at this point.
it is. And it creates this thing. But at the same time, those platforms do offer you an opportunity to sort of create community and have a bigger impact. And I'll use myself as an example. I started back in 2023. I started a series on YouTube called "The Art of Sucking at Music," and it was born out of sort of my frustration in working in the music tech industry, where all of the innovations were sort of all about flattening the learning curve when it came to music. And my whole argument was sort of that, like, you're never going to fully flatten that music curve. And, by doing so, you're kind of making people believe that, or by trying to do that, and by putting out, content that says, oh, this thing can make you be able to play music instantly or whatever, you're kind of duping people into believing that if they don't get it right away, they must suck at it.
Mm-hmm.
When the truth is that any skill that's worth developing is going to take time, and it's worth putting that time in. And so that's where the idea for that channel or that series came. And the premise was, I've been playing music for 35 years. I've been touring in bands for 20 years. And, anybody that might see me playing at a show or whatever would consider me to be like a good musician. But the truth is that there's a ton of stuff in music that I really suck at and that I'm continuously learning. And every musician that you admire, every artist that you admire, there's something about music that they suck at, but you never get to see that part. So I want to invite you to come, join me on my journey to learn things and watch me suck at things, so that hopefully you feel okay sucking at things when you first start picking them up. It was a wanting to encourage people to keep going, even if they feel like, they're not getting it or whatever, because there's always that period of time you have to suck at something in order to get good at it.
And you can find that series on your YouTube channel, the Chris Hayzel music channel.
I've actually watched a few of those.
Yeah.
What was cool about it, and what was funny is, like, I had spent the previous 3 or 4 years at Artifon, which was a music tech company in Nashville, doing all of their video content. This was one of the main arguments that I had with their philosophy about the flattening of the music curve. And so after I left Artifon, I started this channel sort of slightly out of spite. But, like, I didn't expect it to do anything, because I knew the algorithm game and I knew how hard it was to break through. In the very first video, which is called "The Art of Sucking at Music," I didn't expect that to do well at all, because it was just basically a thesis statement. It was like, here's what this channel's about. That video, like, exploded, and then, at least by my standards, I think it went on to get something like 250,000 views. But the thing that was really, really surprising to me was the amount of comments that just flooded in, of so many people sort of relaying their experiences, like, oh my God, thank you for saying this out loud. Or, I was about to give up on guitar. I really appreciate, the encouragement to keep going. And then watching those people interact with each other and, like, encourage and support each other in the comments. And so, like, this sort of organic community formed just in the comments section of that video. And then so I was like, oh shit. And I kept doing more videos and I only did a handful of them, but it was always that thing where in the comments, these people were just sort of, it was like I had inadvertently created the community that I feel like is missing in a lot of music today. And I think that while, like, modern technology has made music a more individual pursuit, while the platforms do make you compete for algorithm or for algorithmic, favor, I do think that people are sort of the same as they've always been, and they're hungry for the same types of substance and the same types of support and community that we've always needed. And we live in an era where that's sort of less available. So you have these platforms where if you're willing to be vulnerable and you're willing to be real and you're willing to give value and also say the quiet part out loud, you actually might be surprised at how well people will respond to that. Instead of trying to compete and just do more product reviews, or instead of trying to compete and just like do whatever the latest trending video is, if you can actually be real and vulnerable and supportive and give value, you actually might create that community. And so that technology, for all of the ways that I don't like, modern platforms, it also allowed me to have an impact that sort of far exceeded any impact that I would have been able to have by just making music and releasing it as an independent artist. So it's like a double-edged sword,
Yeah.
I was going to say, you have to think about what you're trying to create in a broader sense than just the songs.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same way that, back in the day, you really still needed to make a music video, even as an indie band, at least
Mm-hmm.
one. And when you were consuming it, the reason you were reading the lyrics and following a band was because you felt some kind of kinship with them. You felt like what they were writing mirrored what you were feeling, or had some resonance with your lived experience. And so what I think we're tapping there is meeting, through the music that you created and the aesthetics in music that you valued, so did other people. And so when they found your video or shared your video, they saw a bit of themselves in you, and then also saw a bit of their experience and struggle in what you were expressing. And so it became that same communal thing where they felt collaborative, in that they were feeling what you felt. They were, okay, this person's like me. They're a dumbass like I am in these same ways, and are also fascinated in becoming in that quest to suck less in the same way that I am.
Yeah. And not only that, but also seeing each other in each other. That content was sort of the catalyst. Like I could care less about anybody caring about me or what I'm doing. What I care about is that they were seeing each other in each other, and then interacting with each other in that way, and being like, you know what, you're not alone. No, you're not alone. None of us are alone in this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, it makes me think of like the whole like fitness influencer space. How you have like everyone's super ripped. You go on Instagram, everyone's shredded. Everyone, they're living these lavish lifestyles and stuff. And then you have someone who comes along like a Sam Sulek or something, who changed the kind of like how people see fitness videos. It was just boring shots of him just doing his thing. I mean, he was already kind of jacked, but but like he's just like not trying to be like, hey, what's up, blah blah, and that whole spiel.
Yeah.
But then you also started seeing people doing these transformation journeys where it's like, I was 300 pounds and in, a year I lost, 250 pounds. And they started off showing them, like changing their diets. Like when you watch, My 600 Pound Life or like shows like that, that's why those shows are so engaging, because you're seeing someone, because a lot of people struggle with, obesity or health issues, because, it's just kind of how it is now.
Yeah.
And then you see people, their journey, and a lot of people see that journey because no one sees all the months of burning fat or getting jacked or shredded or whatever, But when you see someone who's going through the process, who you're like, actually kind of looks like me, like I'm around, X amount of body fat or whatever. And then you see someone do it, it's like, wow, I can do it too. Because that's the journey that nobody shares. Everyone sits in isolation, and then you see the final product. Look at how awesome I am.
Absolutely.
It's like, but you're not that awesome. You're just like every other person who's done it before. You're just not showing the work. And I think where you see, it's like what you're talking about with these, music companies that are coming out, or even with like, AI software of like, all you got to do is this, and it's great. It's like the musical fat loss pill that everyone wants, but no one wants to go into the gym for an hour a day and do the actual grind.
That's such a good analogy. The musical fat loss pill. Yeah.
I mean, that's what it's kind of what it feels like, because everyone's looking for that quick fix or whatever. And it's like, that's not what it's about. It's not about a quick fix. It's about a journey of just pursuing something you're interested in. Because you got to think about it. It's like, if you don't really care about music, like, why are you doing it? If you're just trying to do it to get like a quick buck or something, it's not going to last.
No.
And, it's not what it's about. And I think people just need to enjoy more of the journey.
Yeah. I think the line that I got a lot of feedback on in that first video, and the one that kind of summarizes the whole series and the whole philosophy is when someone goes and sees their favorite musician, they'll leave and they'll go, oh, that person's so talented. But they're not. They're just, musicians are just really, really good at being bad at something. And we keep being bad at that thing until we're not bad at it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's any skill development. You just have to be good at being bad at it and allow yourself to be bad at it.
Yeah. It's like that. You're smarter once you realize you don't know everything. That kind of thing. It's just like, I've accepted the point that like, I'll never be as good as Alan Holdsworth. But it's like I can be happy at knowing that I can have a musical idea and at least try to make it a realization. Like, to me, that's more fulfilling than making a YouTube video where you're just playing guitar at like 800 miles per hour just for someone to be like, dude, that's sick. But it's like, okay, cool, someone like 100 people said you're sick and your video got 50,000 views. Now what? Like, what are you going to do with that information? It's like everyone's saying, it's like when you hear that, like, oh, but everyone says you're so beautiful your whole life. You didn't work to do that. But then it's like, it doesn't matter. You can still feel like you're the ugliest person in the room.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with it. It's all about, how you feel about what you're doing, or being happy with yourself, or at least trying to pursue happiness and whatever that means to you. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, just it goes so much deeper than just like the short form content and algorithm stuff, which I think a lot of people just need to realize. And I think more people are now, especially when you see with like so much, people talking about mental health and things like that. It's like we're all just trying to be happy. It's just finding however we can get there. That's that's the pursuit I'm trying to do.
I think it creates an interesting dichotomy in how a person can do a lot of this. On one hand, having, the hardware, the equipment needed to do some pretty good audio and video presentation, so that everybody kind of has, because people are drawn to that sort of like essentially TV quality sort of experience, which, we take it for granted, but that we all three of us here are sitting with that. We all have good microphones. They're not extravagant, but they simply that's now possible compared to the way it used to be. We essentially are equipped better than a radio station would be.
Sure.
Back in the day. And so you're giving that kind of experience to people, but at the same time, the audience still wants to feel connected by common struggle. Like a lot of these iconic bands we've talked about, their rise came because they were so outsider. They were so sort of like immersed in their struggle, in their ordinary struggle.
Yeah, they gave voice to a larger community of people.
Yeah,
they were voicing the way that they were feeling.
Yeah, like 9 Inch Nails, his first album, he was like making coffee at a radio station while he was making Pretty Hate Machine. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It was born of struggle of like, not having access to audiences or to technology or those resources, and then making that work. And the audience responded to that struggle, that they were listening to somebody who themselves was trying to drag themselves out of the mud. And now, like, a lot of musicians that are whether or not they're succeeding or just expressing themselves to their niche audience, they're sharing what they're going through. They're not just, okay, here's my song, here's my music video. They're also doing, sort of on camera work where they're talking about their struggle, where they're, about their ordinary problems and how that intersects with the music they're making. And I think that too is a way it's the same as it was. It's just done in a different way now because it can be more face to face and direct. And, I think that's what's interesting about now. I mean, obviously the situation we're in it's problematic, to say the least. It's difficult. But there is that route, I think, still available to use what's there available now and to weave that into a new way of expressing yourself as a musician and as a creative mind to a community and to build that community. And I hope that becomes a way forward for people to do this kind of thing. In a way, that's sort of what we're doing now. If a person has listened this far into it, to our rant, part of it is because we're the background noise. We're just the drone that, kind of like allows their inner sort of monologue to take a rest and just kind of go along for the ride, or they're learning something from it, or all of the above. In that way, this is sort of that same thing where we're trying to surf a wave of ideas and give our audience that wave to ride along with us. I think that is one good thing about now, is that that's possible, and it's easy to create these things. It may not always be good. I mean, this podcast is probably mostly terrible, but I don't think so. But
if you're vacuuming your living room, and you've hung in this far, we applaud you. Thank you.
We applaud. Yeah. We thank you. We gain nothing from it in any meaningful sense, other than that this is catharsis for us, and we hope it's in a way catharsis for the audience, because we all are living in this same bucket of ever increasing slop. And we're just humans. None of us have a filter going on. We just have okay cameras, and I mean, nothing great. I just have a Logitech webcam going. But it's like in the era we live in, that's all. We're here. We're people doing the best we can and expressing ourselves and inviting expression in return. And so, I mean, I think that's what the reason for this podcast, beyond like where we get into the technical side of what we do, I think it's also just like, all right, well, let's dig into that. What is all this about? I don't mean making music. I mean being a person who makes music, just trying to make sense of any of what is happening now and what has happened up till now and what might come next. Well, I think let's wrap it up. And do you got anything that we haven't plugged that you want to plug, Chris?
I mean, if you're doing something cool and you want help doing it, and you want help with branding and marketing stuff, you can go to helloevernorth.com. If you're just curious about checking out the Art of Sucking at Music, which is now a 3-year-old show, but you can go to youtube.com/@Chris Hayzel Music. I think that's how you get there, or you just search Chris Hayzel Music and you'll find it there. But, ultimately, I'm just stoked to be hanging out here with you guys, having this conversation.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it's really, really cool getting to talk to you a little bit more. I know, the few times we've had to talk, we never really got to just kind of riff on life and music and all that stuff. So yeah, it's really awesome getting to talk to you. And, I relate a lot to your story. So it's cool just, talking with other people, and I don't feel alone.
Yeah, it's not so lonely. No, yeah. It's the same for me. I've always, every time we talked, we were always talking business, but even in those conversations, I could tell I was like, I think I have a lot in common with these guys.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, hopefully we get to catch up. I don't know if you're going to be at NAMM, but hopefully,
I will be. Yeah.
Hopefully we'll bump into each other or set something up. But dude, it's awesome to have you on, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys for having me. This was fun.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, You have a good one, and yeah, we'll see you soon. A couple weeks.
Bye.
Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thanks so much for listening, and if you enjoyed this podcast, you can listen to more episodes just like this one on all streaming platforms like Spotify and Apple Music, and also make sure to subscribe to the Soundiron YouTube channel to stay up to date on everything else we got going on with new products, interviews, and plenty of other cool content. So thanks so much, and we will see you soon. Take care.